here. There it is. Yeah, kind of like comparing what that would represent, and yeah, like looking at the symbolisms, and I think what I have tonight is, in essence, the symbolism of like the first six verses, because the first six verses, I think, discuss practically all the symbolism in the chapter. I mean, because from there forward, it gives away to, the king trying to get the wise men to answer, and then Daniel brought, or the queen comes in, and then Daniel, and then eventually he does answer, and then Babylon's taken over. So,
right.
So primarily the symbolism, and like, from at least from what I see in the first like six verses, and what they might mean in the New Testament. Some of which do refer to Revelation, but not. I don't know. I don't remember if all of them do, but some of them do. But anyway, okay. So now, what does Babylon represent?
What does Babylon? Do you mean the Wayward Church? Is that what we're doing something a little different from that?
Well, we're trying. I mean, the spiritual understanding would be the wayward, God's wayward people at the end. Yeah, that would certainly be one of them. What else is it? What else does it refer to? I mean, yeah, harlot Christianity, end time harlot of God is you're right. That's what it is. But what else?
Could it represent humanity as a whole?
Yeah, it could. It even could represent, I'm sure, like end time nations.
Yeah.
It could be representative of the U.S. in some regard. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to discuss that, but I know that could be what it is. Some people see that there, and I think it's true. It's there too.
Yeah.
And so it's a nation that God uses to take his people into captivity. It's mentioned kind of like all over. It's mentioned obviously here, mentioned in Revelation. It's mentioned a lot in Jeremiah. Yeah. And it's mentioned in a lot of different places, but in particular, like the judgment of Babylon, and like Jeremiah in the 40s and the 50s, Jeremiah 40, I'm going to say 8, 7, 9, and Jeremiah 50 and 51.
That's what I'm reading right now. And in Jeremiah, they're talking about how the Lord's using Babylon to punish Israel and Judah for their, he's allowing them to be captured and telling them, let me think, what did I just read? He's telling the nation they are going to be taken captive by Babylon, I believe. And that any of the prophets that tell them they're not are false prophets.
Right. And so that could certainly fit the U.S. or nations, and it could fit a bunch of different things, because I think it has a broad meaning. And I've heard people talk about it as far as, U.S. being the harlot. It certainly is the harlot. That's for darn sure. I mean, my gosh, we're like a harlot on, speed or something right now with the way we're spiraling downward and so forth. But anyway, Belshazzar would be representative of who?
I don't know.
Well, he would be the king of Babylon. So he would represent in here whoever the king of Babylon might be at the end. Now, I don't specifically say it's an individual, but, just as far as him being the representative of the headship at the end of how we probably would look at it as more of a spirit.
I thought that I thought that the king of Babylon, or the head of Babylon, was the Antichrist, that he ran Babylon, New Babylon, like was New Babylon or called New Babylon or whatever. I don't know. That's just, I always thought that the Antichrist ran Babylon at the end. No?
He could. I mean, again, it could be, it could be. I'm not really sure. I'm not 100% sure if the Antichrist, which was around back in First John, way back then, and the spirit was alive, whether it's a system, a thought, whether it's an individual person. It was the spirit of Babylon, or spirit of Antichrist was alive back then in First John. So I'm not sure, but it certainly the spirit of Antichrist would be in Babylon and would be run by Belshazzar. It could be an individual man too. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not, that's for sure. But as far as, okay, let's start and look at in the first two verses. He makes a great feast for his thousands of lords. They, of course, drink wine. And then he commands the gold and silver to be brought to them from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had brought, and they get ready to drink from. So let's turn to Ephesians 5:18.
You want us to read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit.
Okay, remember, we're looking at this spiritually. So the implication of those that are drunken with wine suggests that they are not filled with what?
The Spirit.
The Spirit. Okay, so they're not filled with the Spirit. So again, applying that to the Daniel 5, we can see that these aren't spiritually filled people. All right, they're not. They're well, we'll talk about what they are in a minute, but yeah, so they're not filled with the Spirit. So let's turn to 1 Thessalonians 1:5, verses 4 through 8. 1 Thessalonians 5:4 through 8.
I'm going to get my charger.
Somebody want to read that?
Yeah. But you, brothers and sisters, in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are all children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. Again, sober, right? For those who sleep at night, and those who get drunk get night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as breastplates and the hope of salvation as a helmet.
Okay, so here Paul contrasts drunkenness with being in the dark and soberness with being in the day. He also contrasts sleeping with those that are at night who are drunk, and right, those that are awake with, does it say awake? Children of light with yes, those that are awake and sober. Mm-hmm. Now, so spiritually in darkness and light, and that day, whatever that day is, and I think might say that day that he's referring to would be which day again?
Day
The day
7.
is coming.
Yeah, probably day 7. So they're not watching. They're spiritually sleeping. Now, he's not talking to unbelievers here. He's talking to, he's encouraging the Thessalonians because they're, unlike the Corinthians, very spiritual. And has very nice things to say towards them, unlike a lot of the Corinthians who are, although they go through the motions, they're not really, you know, in any way, shape, or form. There's not spirit-based. So he then says they're not watching. If they're at night, they're spiritually sleeping and they're drunken. Okay, so now let's apply this to Belshazzar in Babylon. Okay, the first one, darkness. Does what happened in Daniel 5 happen in darkness?
It does.
Okay. Now, did the day that they're about to, and I already answered it, will the day come as a thief for them?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Were they watching?
No, not at all.
I know they weren't physically asleep, but they were drunken, right?
They were.
Okay, so we see that certainly applies to those that were in Babylon. So let's go to the next verse, and no, we could stay with the same verse. They've already taken out the gold and silver vessels, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So let's turn to 2 Timothy 2, verse 20. 2 Timothy 2:20.
I got it. In a large house, there are articles, not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes and some for common use.
Mine says the vessels are of gold and silver. I know yours says article. Mine's, for whatever reason, mine says vessels. And he says, and some are also of wood and earth, some unto honor and some unto dishonor. So I think we've read this before in the past. Which ones of those do you think were the honorable ones? Which one of those 4 items there in that verse do you think would be considered the honorable vessels?
Gold and silver?
Right. And the dishonorable?
Wood and earth.
So is it possible that this is some type of metaphor describing obviously the same thing like in Daniel, okay? But also in the last verse we read, is it a metaphor between the sons of day or light versus the sons of darkness or night?
Yeah, I mean, it could be.
Okay. That's what I get out of this. So the vessels of gold and silver would have been taken from God's temple. All right, and brought in Daniel. But yeah, I do think it's a metaphor that for whatever reason within the same house, God uses the vessels for his purpose. I know it doesn't make sense because God still have wood and earth, and he uses them to dishonor, whatever that's supposed to mean. But he uses them for his purpose, even though in theory they're considered dishonorable. Or yours said common, Don?
Yeah, common.
Okay. So we can see that the vessels of gold and silver are honorable. And in the example back in Daniel, they're being used by the dishonorable or the sons of darkness or Babylon, or however you want, the sleeping, the drunken, that aren't watching, that aren't recognizing that a thief is on his way, that are spiritually in darkness, blah, blah, blah. It's not hard to see. In Daniel 4, verse 4, 5 verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood. What do you guys think would be the significance there?
What do we think would be the significance of what?
Well, here they are. They're drinking out of the sons of day, or the vessels of honor, the gold and silver vessels that are in God's house that are unto
and praising other gods.
Yeah.
And praising other gods, period. That's it, right?
Yeah, I would think so. I wish I could say I had. The only thing I could say, let's turn to Romans 1 and start at verse 18. So what we're going to see is a similar pattern here. In this, we're going to read 1:18. We're going to see the same pattern unfold in this chapter, where things that start off or seem to have value begin, like some of them slip away and become vessels of dishonor. But let's read Romans 1:18 first.
Okay, so the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness.
Anybody have anything different there?
Well, I also have this. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness.
How can you hold the truth in unrighteousness?
I don't know. That's why I think that's why I would read the other one to say, oh, they're pressing the truth. They're holding it and not letting you see it.
So somehow they're in the process or trying, or they are holding it, but they're not holding it correctly. Is that the idea?
They're holding it to hide it.
They're suppressing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. I have just in the King James, I like the way he said it there. They hold the truth, but they do it in unrighteousness. So they're in some form or fashion in possession of the truth, but they're not doing it correctly. Okay.
Like the vessels we just read about.
Yeah. Like the dishonorable vessels.
Good job, Don.
Yeah.
Yep. That's interesting.
So read up 19 through 22.
Do you want me to read it in the one, either one? Doesn't matter. Okay.
Doesn't matter.
Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
Is that 21 and 22?
Oh, 22 or 21? Okay.
21 and 22.
For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God or gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they be wise, they became fools.
So these would represent the end time Babylon that know God, or sort of know God, but they didn't glorify him as God.
Right.
Other things took over, and that became, they became thinking that they were smarter. They became fools, and they became, I guess, dishonorable. I'm guessing they somehow start off but they become dishonorable. But there are those that aren't. But the bigger point is they don't glorify him as God. So much like the gold, silver, brass, iron. And let's read 25 too.
25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served creation rather than their creator, who is forever praised. Amen.
So that's exactly what it says in Daniel 5. They changed it. So let's read the next two verses, 26 and 7.
Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations of ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error.
So again, yeah, 26. So God gives them up and had to have them in order to give them up. I'm sorry. Sometimes my autocorrect when I do my notes changes a word or two and it doesn't make sense. So they ultimately come fools. And one of the byproduct of this seems to be, according to these verses, is homosexuality.
Yeah.
And my gosh, if we don't see evidence of this today. So
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Now here's the same process spoken a little bit different. Okay, and this is in Revelation 9. So if we could turn to Revelation 9, verse 13 and 14. So Babylon's exchanged the truth of God for a lie. The Revelation 9, 13 and 14. Somebody want to read this? Now, Revelation is hard to understand, and there's little snippets that I feel like when I see it, I'm like, oh, I think I sort of understand this. But this is,
I do know what you mean.
This is might be one of them. I'm not suggesting I'm right here, but I think it might be one.
It's okay. That you think you understand? Okay.
I think it's telling the same story that we just read in Daniel and in Romans, but I think it's similar.
What were the verses?
Daniel 9, 13 and 14. I'm sorry, Revelation 9, 13 and 14.
Oh, yeah. Okay. The sixth angel sounded his trumpet, and I heard a voice coming from the four horns of the golden altar that is before God. It said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who were bound at the great river Euphrates. Okay.
Now, last week we spoke a little bit at the end about the river Euphrates. What nation was on that? Which city in particular spanned that river?
The Babylon.
Beads. Oh, where was the river? Oh, right next to Babylon. It protected
Babylon.
Through it.
Went right through it. Now,
yeah,
I never really understood the significance of this river until I was reading this, and I listened, because what we're going to do what my thoughts are, and then I'm going to give you some thoughts that I heard somebody else talk that I thought was insightful. But this river Euphrates, I think, is simply a reference to Babylon. That's what's at the river Euphrates. And obviously we know what happens in Daniel, because the river's dried up artificially by the Medes and Persians, and they come over and take over as a thief in the night, right? They take over Babylon and, destroy it or take over it, whatever, and the king is killed. Now let's watch this. Let's see if it follows the same pattern in 15 and 16.
And the four angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of the mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number.
So these troops that originate from the four angels that had been in the Euphrates, that's sort of the metaphor. What I think it's saying is the four angels from Babylon. And you know what they would do here? They would go, it says they should kill a third part of men, and the numbers of the army, and mine has of horsemen. Okay. The reason I'm referring to horsemen, because we want to look to see what horsemen mean, because this is a big time like parable. And it says they kill 10,000 times 10,000, which I think is 100 million or something like that. And I heard them. Now, in the past, we always thought this was physical, that something was going to go out and kill 100 million people. But I think the metaphor here is spiritual. In other words, God allows the angels of Babylon, who would be nothing more than, he allows his church to be, a portion of them to be killed. Why? Killed in what way? They're spiritually killed. They're spiritually, he allows them to be killed, not naturally, but spiritually. So with that being said, it makes mention of the horsemen. So let's take a peek at another verse in Psalms 147, verse 10, and see what that might say about horses and horsemen.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
47. So you're chosen by God from the beginning. Your name is you're chosen, and God loves you. Why would he throw you, allow you to be taken away? Is this people who aren't chosen, who say they are? Like, I don't understand. Do you understand? Do you know what I'm saying?
I don't understand. I know what you're saying.
I do. I just don't know the answer to that. I kind of feel like this is his plan. It's his, in another place I think in the Old Testament, it's described as his strange work, because he allows his people, in essence, to, very, like, for instance, it's the same idea. You take them out of Egypt, go into the wilderness, and who makes it into the promised land? Just Caleb and Joshua? That's it. So all the other gazillion of them die in the wilderness, including Moses.
Right.
Does that plan make a whole lot of sense? I mean, statistically speaking, what's the ratio of success? It seems very, very small. I don't understand his plan either, dude.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that he does make reference to kind of the same thing, because we find before Jesus comes, he's prepared this Old Testament people, not Jesus hasn't, but God with the law. And by the time Jesus comes, there's so few that actually recognize him, just a handful. Everybody else, what happens to them? They're lost in the wilderness, I guess. You know what I mean? So it's kind of his strange work that doesn't make sense. I'm just pointing out the fact that Revelation seems to hint at the same sort of thing, kind of. That's what I think it does. Okay. But anyway, getting back to the horsemen, 147:10, if somebody wants to read that.
147. His pleasure is not in the strength of the horse, nor his delight in the legs of the warrior.
Anybody have anything slightly different?
Mm-mm.
The only difference, mine says he delights not in the strength of the horse. He takes no pleasure in the legs of a man, of a man or man.
Okay.
All right. So here he's equating the strength of horses with the legs of a man. Okay. Now, we want to keep this symbolism because we're going to turn to a second verse that also describes the same thing. All right. But keep in mind, he doesn't delight the strength of horses. He's equating with the legs of man. Okay. So let's turn to Isaiah 31:3.
But the Egyptians are mere mortals and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, those who help will stumble. Those who are helped will fall. All will perish together.
Huh.
I don't even understand it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's look at this. Remember in Revelation, God calls. I'm drawing a blank. He calls his people Egypt, and what was the other nation he calls them? Sodom, right?
Sodom,
spiritually, they're called Egypt and Sodom. Okay. He's referring to, and I think that's in Revelation 11. He's referring to his wayward people there, I believe. Hold on.
That's not a good thing. That's not a good.
Yeah. So here we're reading what is an example of the Egyptian, that God leaves these little clues all over the Bible and says, look, the Egyptian portion of my church is going to stumble. For instance, he says the Egyptians are men and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. Now, remember, we read in, was it Romans about, no, it wasn't Romans, it was earlier, about somebody was drunk, they didn't have the spirit. Okay. We also were reading the fact that when he says the Egyptians are men, he's referring to the Egyptians of the Old Testament, but he's also referring to what will be his wayward Egyptian people sometime in the future that try to worship him in spirit, but they do it with horses. In other words, the horses, which we just read in the previous verse, were example of the legs of men. Now he's making an example of the Egyptians are fleshly and not spirit. In other words, they don't have my spirit, but they say they're worshiping me, but they're not.
Yeah.
They're worshiping things of their own creation, the legs of men. Okay, do you sort of understand that verse a little better? In other words, their programs and all they're doing are their own creation. They're doing it in my behalf. Yeah, they're saying it's mine, but there's no spirit in it. I'm not really there.
Okay.
Now it says, when the Lord shall stretch out his hand. What does that mean?
I don't know. I was going to ask you, is he talking about judgment?
Yes.
Okay.
So he's saying those who help when he's trying to impart judgment are going to stumble because the church doesn't have his spirit in them, and they're going to try to help thinking they're helping, but they're going to stumble.
They're going to stumble the same way that the church. Why? Well, because they're not really awake. They're drunken. They're sleeping. They're in the dark. They weren't watching like they were supposed to. And they come to the realization, well, maybe they don't, maybe they do. They come to the realization that a lot of the things that they did in an effort to serve and watch weren't spirit-led. They were fleshly.
Right.
Okay. So the horse represents the fleshly work of Babylon that God allows to hijack and infiltrate his church back in Revelation. Let's go back to Revelation.
Okay, I think I get it now.
Spiritually, many of his people will be, that sit there and think, well, I'm good. I'm sitting in this great feast in Babylon, but not realizing that they're really considered like an Egyptian that have used horses to follow God, thinking that that's how he was leading them, so to speak. So let's go back to Revelation. We have like 4.5 minutes, but we can get a couple.
Is it 9? Revelation 9?
Yeah, 9, 17, and 18, I think we're on.
Oh, are we still reading?
Yeah. Revelation 9. We took a detour to figure out what the horse.
I know. I thought we were looking back at that to understand it, and now I get it. Mounted to. Okay. Do you want me to read, Dee, or do you want to read?
Yeah, go ahead.
17 and 18. The horses and riders I saw in my vision looked like this. Their breastplates were fiery red, dark blue, and yellow as sulfur. The heads of the horses resembled the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and sulfur. A third of mankind was killed by the 3 plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur that came out of their mouths.
You can do 19 too.
The power of the horses was in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails were like snakes, having heads, which they inflict injury. That's interesting. I always took that literally, which I could never understand literally, like what? But now I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah, it's one of those things you just have to kind of pray about. But I feel like Revelation is so metaphoric.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of turn to the Old Testament. Usually the Old Testament is the key to unlocking a lot of the things, but it's hard to understand because we had been trained always to take it literally.
Yeah.
So the point seems to be that God allows his fleshly people to remain fleshly, in which case he paints the picture here. This is a picture of the horses of Babylon, the horsemen of Babylon, be it his four angels coming out. And this is a picture of those fleshly people, what's going to happen to them. Now, one other thing, which we'll do, I think we have 2.5 minutes. It makes mention of their tails in verse 19. Their tails are like unto serpents that have heads, which they hurt them. So let's turn real fast to Isaiah 9 in verse 15. And to see if we can figure out what the tail is.
The elder dignitaries, the prophets who teach lies, are the tail. Wow. Elders and dignitaries are the head. The prophets who teach lies are the tail. Interesting.
Yeah, because in the previous verse it says Jehovah will cut off from Israel the head and the tail in one day. So you see this consistency with which we're describing the same picture in a lot of these locations. Anyway, there's a minute left, but yeah, so you get a picture. He's painting a picture in Revelation that John sees of what seems to be the whole process that makes God seem like the bad guy, even though he probably would desire that all of these people are saved, but man have a decision here. And if they're swept away in fleshly, I don't want to say it's not at all Christianity, but a large portion of Christianity that's very fleshly and do things of their own power, that God says, all right, that's what you're going to do. You have my word. You can seek my spirit, but you don't. And you're going to say, this is me. Well, this is what the outcome is going to be. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's cut and we'll start at Revelation 9, 20 and 21. And then we'll go back to Daniel.
Okay.
Right.
See you in a minute.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Revelation 9 what?